With Lululemon, the real gift happens when they're living in it. When you give the fan favorite everywhere belt bag, the real gift is... And when the ultra-soothing Rest Feel slides are the gift, you're really giving them... This holiday, Lululemon makes it easy to give little luxuries that go beyond. Open the moment. Shop now at Lululemon.com.
His code name's Jackal. He's an exceptional assassin.
Streaming now on Peacock.
He will kill again, unless we stop him.
Academy Award winner Eddie Redmayne.
You're paying me to kill him. I am charging you for getting away.
The Jackal's here. Look at the exits.
BAFTA Award winner Lashana Lynch.
I will find him, and I will kill him myself. I like to win.
So do I.
The Day of the Jackal. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode in our 15 Fictions for Summer series. This is part 1 of 2 episodes about George Eliot's magnificent, monumental Middlemarch. Full disclosure up front, I've always thought of George Eliot's Middlemarch as my favourite novel, and therefore, because I'm biased, as the greatest novel in the English language. I first read it maybe, I think, 35 years ago. And I say first read it, actually, until a few weeks ago. That was the only time that I'd read it. So it's a hazy memory. I've just clung to it as a faith that it's the greatest novel. I reread it to talk about it today. Rereading it after more than 3 decades, it seems like a very different book, partly because I can't really remember. I was surprised by some of the things that happened. I didn't fully remember the plot. I still think it's amazing. But I did find myself thinking as I read it, am I really going to be able to say that this is a political fiction? It is in part a book about politics. Actually, it does have some straightforwardly political themes. It's about a middling-sized town in the middle of England, Middlemarch, where there is local politics, as there is in every town, and there's local politics in this novel. There are fights about positions on the hospital board. There is an election to Parliament for the seat of Middlemarch, and quite a lot of contention about who should stand and who should get in. And in the background, there are some big political themes. Big things are happening in England at the time that the book is set. But I don't think I can claim that those are the central themes of the book. It is primarily about personal relationships. It's about love and marriage and friendship, and it's about trust and betrayal, but seen through the relationships between individual human beings, many of whom have got nothing to do with those wider political currents. And yet those relationships are framed around a question which I think is the central political question, maybe not of all politics, but I would say of all great political fictions. And that is the relationship between morality and power. That's what this book is about, how morality shapes power, how power shapes morality. And in trying to make sense of that, George Eliot does make sense, or tries to make sense, of everything. And that does include politics. Middlemarch was published in 1872. It was published before that in installments, so it's from 1871 to 1872. It was one of those Victorian novels that came out in parts before it came out as a whole. It's set, though, 40 years earlier. The action of the book happens between 1829 and 1832. So there's a 40-year lag between the writing of the book, the publication of the book, and the setting of the book. And reading it now, 150 years on, it's quite hard to capture what that means, because 40 years isn't much in the span of 2 centuries. And certainly, I think for many readers in the 21st century, Middlemarch just feels like a 19th century novel. It doesn't matter so much where in the 19th century it's set. For many readers, Middlemarch feels like maybe even the classic Victorian novel, the novel of Victorian England. But it's not. George Eliot very deliberately sets it in that earlier period because that is pre-Victorian England. Actually, when the book starts in 1829, it's not just the king before Victoria, it's the king before Victoria. The king who is dying is George IV. The Duke of Wellington is prime minister, and George Eliot, at one or two points in the book, says to her readers, just to remind you, this is a long time ago, the Duke of Wellington was prime minister. That 40-year gap that doesn't seem like much to us is half or more human lifetime for George Eliot and for her readers. It is her lifetime. She was a child, an adolescent when the book is set. She's a mature adult by the time that she's writing it. Those 40 years really matter, and it's hard to reconstruct how they matter. But part of the reason they do is that the book is deliberately set in a before time. It is before some of the things that make the period of 1870, 1871, 1872, what you might call high Victorian English life, what it is. Just going to give a few examples of some of the things that make the setting of Middlemarch history for its readers, its contemporary readers. So one, a background event that lies behind not much, but a bit of the story of the novel is cholera, a cholera outbreak, an expected cholera outbreak in Middlemarch. So the town of Middlemarch is probably based on Coventry. That's what we need to think of it as, because Coventry was not where George Eliot was born. She was born in Nuneaton, which is a market town a little bit north of Coventry. But she went to school as a teenager in Coventry, and eventually she moved to Coventry and was there as a young adult. Coventry, which is a manufacturing town, was and is a manufacturing town not far from Birmingham. And in Coventry in 1831, 1832, there was a real fear of cholera. Cholera was coming from Europe, and it reaches London in 1832. There's a terrible cholera outbreak. So this is not London, but there's a real fear it's coming to Middlemarch, and local dignitaries start planning for what they're going to do. Most of the planning consists of working out where they're going to bury the dead. Where is the burial ground going to be? Because in 1832, cholera is not well understood. No one actually knows what's causing it. The prevalent theory was a kind of superstition about diseased air. The word that was used for it was miasma. Miasma meant there was something that was being passed in the air that sickened people and led them to die, which made it very, very hard to think there was anything that could be done to protect against it. It's quite hard not to breathe the air. You could wear a mask, but as we know, masks aren't that effective against what was thought to be diseased air. So there's a fatalism about cholera in Middlemarch. We've got to plan for the dead. That's 40 years ago from when Eliot is writing. It all changes in those intervening 40 years. There's another great cholera outbreak in London that spreads, but primarily focused in London at the end of the 1840s, and the beginning of an understanding from some doctors, though massive resistance from the medical establishment. And one of the themes of Middlemarch, actually, there are some doctors in this book, is the resistance of the medical establishment to new ideas. But it was discovered by one or two far-sighted people that cholera was caused not by diseased air, but by water, by the drinking supply, by contaminated water, and above all, by sewage. But it still took another 20 years before that became widely accepted. There's another cholera outbreak in London in 1866, but this time it does prompt action, parliamentary action, legislation to create what we might now call modern, safe sewage systems to clean up the water. This is a disease of cities, of the poor often near rivers or water supplies, and Parliament acts to protect the population against cholera, and it works. So in 1866, it turns out that was the last time that cholera came to England. I'm not sure in 1871, 1872, anyone knew that. Cholera is still a real live thing. It's still rampant on the continent of Europe. There's still going to be some terrible cholera outbreaks, particularly in Germany, at the end of the 19th century. But in England, by 1872, cholera is a disease of the past because there is an understanding of it. In 1832, cholera was real, it was live, it was very poorly understood, and it was terrifying. 1829 to 32 is also the very dawn of the railway age. By 1870, England is a nation of railways, and people can travel. They can travel from Coventry to London. People can move around. Journeys that used to take, indeed, in 1830 would have taken days, by 1870 take hours. But when Middlemarch is set, none of this has happened. The very first railway line in England between Darlington and Stockport opened in 1825, 4 years before the novel starts. The first railway link between two major cities, between Liverpool and Manchester, was in 1830, after the novel has started. And yet the characters in the novel all know that the railways are coming. Everyone is talking about the railways. It's one of the big themes of the book. The railways are coming, but no one in this novel has ever been on one. No one has ever been on a train. They don't know anything about it, and they're scared. Many of the characters are scared. As George Eliot says of the people in her novel, when the public doesn't know about something, it is invariably against it. And people were against the railways. There were many superstitions about them, but there was also quite a lot of far-sighted understanding of what the railways would mean. There is a scene in the book when a group of farm labourers discover another group of men, some outsiders, walking over the land with measuring rods, and they're clearly surveying it because they're going to purchase it, because this might be where a railway track is going to go. There aren't any railway tracks yet anywhere near Middlemarch, but they're coming. And the farm labourers react violently against this. They beat up the men. They effectively, on a very tiny scale, they riot against this. And one of the surveyors and one of the sort of local gentry come along and try and reason with them and say, what are you doing? There's nothing to be frightened of here. The railways are not going to be bad for you. In the end, they're going to be good for you. They're going to be great for you. The railways represent progress. The railways represent the future. You can't resist it. All of the usual arguments that people make to people who are resisting technological change. And the men who are resisting don't buy it. And they say, among other things, you say all of that, but we know what the railways are for. The railways are just going to make the rich richer. The railways are for the people in power to have more power and to have more wealth. And both sides are right. With hindsight, seen from 1870, George Eliot, we, her readers, then now can see both sides were right. The railways were the future. They were coming. They were going to change, transform people's lives, and they were going to make the rich richer. This is also the age of reform. So in 1832, Parliament passed what was known as the Great Reform Act and then became known as the First Reform Act, because the Second Reform Act happened in 1867, just a few years before Middlemarch was published. But it's set at the time of the First Reform Act, but again, crucially, before the First Reform Act. All of this is before. It's before the railways. It's before cholera is understood. It is before reform. There is talk of reform everywhere in this book. The word comes up a lot. And as George Eliot, as the narrator says, it means very different things to different people. Some people are hoping that reform, political reform, which meant at this time trying to tidy up a sort of semi-proto-democratic electoral system in Britain, which to that point had been corrupt, or as people said at the time, rotten, full of rotten boroughs. Very few people had the vote. Parliament was not in any sense really a democratic institution. This is the beginning of trying to democratize British politics, though that word democracy was not often used because people were still terrified of democracy. And actually, the First Reform Act, the Great Reform Act, didn't change that much. It expanded the franchise in 1832 from about 450,000 to about 650,000 men, all propertied men. The threshold for getting the vote was lowered so that they became known as the 10-pounders. You had to be responsible for £10 worth of property. It's not a radical or revolutionary transformation, but it was understood at the time as the beginning of something, of some shift in the social structure of Britain, the end of an old order. Many people were resisting it, and it was understood that the resistors, the conservatives, small c conservatives, were trying to cling on to the past, and the reformers seemed to embody the future. But it hasn't happened yet. And deeply symbolically for the book, it ends in May 1832, not with the passage of the Reform Act, because the Reform Act passed Parliament in June 1832. It ends in May 1832 with the news that the House of Lords has blocked the Reform Act, the last hurrah of the old order, of the aristocratic order, of the land against the future, the cities, the coming age, the railways, the curing of cholera, everything that reform stood for different people in different ways. The book ends with the dying breath of the old order. And then the biggest change of all, which is harder to describe, and it's right in the background of this book, it's never explicit. It's embodied in George Eliot's own life. between 1830 and 1870, one of the things that happens in England is the beginning of the loss of faith. What Matthew Arnold called in his poem Dover Beach, which was written right at the middle of the century, at around 1850, thought to have been written around 1850, the withdrawing of the sea of faith. It hasn't happened in the sense that by 1870, England has become, in any sense, a faithless nation, a non-Christian nation, a post-Christian nation, none of that. But some of the things that happened between 1830 and 1870 are the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, the growth of an understanding of Christianity, which started in Germany but spread to England, and partly spread to England through George Eliot, who translated David Strauss's book, The Life of Jesus, the book that captured the idea that Jesus and indeed Christianity might be a historical construct, a human-made construct, not some revealed order of the universe, but something that human beings built for themselves and mythologized for themselves. And it's represented in Eliot's own life by the fact that the act of translating that book and reading and learning and understanding, starting in Coventry among free thinkers in Coventry, led her to lose her faith. Between the setting of Middlemarch and the publication of Middlemarch, George Eliot had long lost her faith. So it's a different world. And yet, in Middlemarch, none of that has happened. And in Middlemarch, religion, Christianity, is the air that people breathe. There are no non-believers in this novel. There are some people one suspects, if you put them under a spotlight, would have very, very serious doubts. But religion is a background fact. It is the fabric of these people's lives. It is how they live. They live by, for, and through religion. And religion is absolutely central to this book. It is a book about a life lived under the auspices of Christian faith and Christian morality, written by someone who had lost that faith. And that gap, it's a gap in time as well as a gap in an understanding of what religion means, informs the whole book. But it's never explicit. But it has to be set in the past. It has to be set in an earlier time so that George Eliot can write about, from her perspective of someone who has seen through some of this, what it is to live a faith-based life. I was thinking about how to recapture the significance of that 40-year gap when we think about it 150 years on. And I think the easiest way to do it is just to imagine a novel written now, set 40 years ago, and what would be the comparable shifts, the comparable changes. How would we frame it? So this is 2024. So a novel set, I don't know, maybe in Coventry, or it doesn't have to be in Coventry, but a Middle England novel set in 1981, 82, 83, 84. That would be the time span. So the early to mid 80s would be the equivalent for us of 1829 to 1832. What would be the analogous themes that might 40 years ago have looked very different than they look now? What would stand in for cholera? AIDS would stand in for cholera in that story. So the early 1980s, there was real fear, real superstition, deep misunderstanding of a disease, AIDS, which was coming. I mean, part of the fear was that people knew it was coming before it actually arrived. Lots of paranoia, lots of folk wisdom and folk superstition, lots of prejudice, and also a medical establishment trying to understand it, often feeling its way in the dark, not feeling there was much that could be done about it, quite a lot of fatalism along with the prejudice. None of this is that different from cholera in 1832. Some of the context, of course, is different, including the connection between AIDS and sex and sexuality. But still, seen from now, the early 1980s attitude to AIDS is quite similar to cholera, seen from 1870 back to 1830. Where are we now with AIDS? It hasn't been eradicated any more than in 1871, 72. People believed cholera had been eradicated, but it is much better understood. It is much better controlled. It is still rampant in other parts of the world, as cholera was back then. Much, but not all, much of the superstition around it and much, but not all, of the prejudice around it has gone the way, for want of a better word, of progress. And yet, of course, there is still profound misunderstanding of all sorts of other medical questions. And one of the things that George Eliot is trying to suggest in setting this against the backdrop of cholera, is not simply that in 1870 people just know better, but we can see a version of ourselves in this earlier time. After all, it's within living memory. Her living memory then, in this case, my living memory now. It's roughly the age in this imagined novel of the early 1880s that George Eliot was in the late 1820s. It's not like a story of progress so that we can say we are better informed, more knowledgeable people than those people. We can see in our understanding of their superstition a reflection of what we must recognize is our continuing superstition. After all, a novel set now, and maybe even a novel published in 40 years' time set now, could make a lot of prejudice and superstition and misunderstanding about COVID and COVID vaccines. For the railways, the early 1980s story would be the coming digital revolution. It's not come yet. It's not there yet in 1982, 83, 84, but it is being talked about as the future and people understand it. And actually the phrase that was used in the early 1980s about the coming digital revolution was the information superhighway. It's very much like the railways. People were talking about the laying down of optic fiber tracks that would connect up all sorts of different parts of the country or parts of the world, that would open up new opportunities, that would speed up information in the way that the railways sped up travel in unimaginable ways. It's very similar. And there was, as always, with things that are not known and poorly understood, a lot of suspicion of this coming revolution, a lot of misunderstanding about it. And there were some people who were saying to the doubters, this is the future. This is going to make all of your lives so much better. This is going to be the transformation that anyone who believes in progress has longed for. And as some of the doubters said, well, isn't it just going to make the rich richer? Isn't it actually just going to entrench power rather than open it up? And both sides were right. Both sides were right about the railways. Both sides were right about the digital revolution. We can see that now. Wouldn't have been known in 1984. For reform, well, the early 1980s were the dawn of the great political changes that sometimes come under the heading of Thatcherism in this country, Reaganism in the United States, sometimes called neoliberalism, though it predates the early 1980s. Some of the seeds of it had been laid earlier, just as the seeds of reform had been bubbling for a while. But it comes to fruition in the early 1980s. But in the early 1980s, no one is sure which way this story is going to go. Thatcherism is not embedded yet in the early 1980s. It's quite precarious. A novel written now, set then, might well make of what we know is going to be the future its precariousness, just as George Eliot makes reform precarious for the people who live through it. It might be that a novel set in Middle England in the early 1980s, ending in 1984, ends on the cusp of the thing that actually does embed Thatcherism in the same way that the Reform Act does embed reform, which would be the miners' strike in England. But before the miners' strike, and even during the early part of the miners' strike, the great contest, it's not clear to the people who are living through it, including, all the memoirs make clear, Thatcher herself, that victory was inevitable. And what would stand in for the loss of faith? So I don't know about that, but thinking about it, and sort of with a dim memory of the early mid-1980s, you could say the thing that we know now that we didn't know then was the opposite of the loss of faith. That is, in the 1980s, it felt like the world was moving beyond religion. Certainly in some of the social, scientific, and intellectual understandings of the world of that period, religion was increasingly treated as a relic of the past. The revolution that began in the middle of the 19th century seemed to be coming to fruition towards the end of the 20th century. Doesn't look like that now. I think we know with 40 years of hindsight that we are living in a faith-based world still. In some ways, there's more of it around than ever. And if there was a belief in the early 1980s that there was a direction of travel in the human experience away from religious faith, that was naive then. It certainly looks naive now. So if we imagine that novel for us, that's how Middlemarch would have felt for its readers in 1872. It's within living memory. So the stories that I've just told about the early 1980s for many people are within living memory. It is us. This is a novel about us. 40 years ago, my imagined novel, her real one, 40 years before she wrote it. The point is these people are recognizably the same people as her readers. Some of them have a single lifespan that can encompass these changes. We're not meant to look at them as with some historical novels. If she'd written a novel that was set in the 1730s or a novel now that was set in the 1880s, where the gap means that what we're looking at are people who are removed from us. It's us, but it's not us. It's us wiser, but also not wiser. And George Eliot makes quite a lot of this. She sort of mocks her readers for their assumption that they are wiser than the people that she's writing about. In one of the lines in the book, when she's talking about two characters who've gone to Rome, and she says of them, "The world was more ignorant of good and evil by 40 years than it is at present. Travellers did not often carry full information on Christian art, either in their heads or their pockets." And she is being deeply ironic. She's mocking her readers, not her characters, for thinking that the 40-year gap, which includes the birth of tourism, actually, and travel and guidebooks, which is what she's talking about here, the fact that in 1870, if you went to Rome, you could take with you a guidebook which could tell you, inform you about what you were looking at. None of that would have been possible in 1830, just as in 1980, if you went to Rome, you couldn't carry around in your pocket a phone that would tell you for everything that it pointed at what it was that you were looking at. She is saying, clearly, we have more information. We have much more information. But she is mocking her readers if they think that means we actually have more wisdom and more understanding of good and evil. Of course we don't. The theme of Middlemarch is that we don't have more understanding of that because we are these people and they are us. It's also the case that Middlemarch is set in that earlier time in the middle of England, middling town, Middle England. It's on the edge of these bigger currents, these wider forces that are going to shape the 19th century. It's not at the heart of this. This is a story of provincial life. Everything that happens in the book is framed by this, but it's not profoundly informed by it, as it might be in other settings. So this is not a London novel. This is not London cholera. This is not the Reform Act as seen by or through the people who did it, who lived it. This is not the railways from the north of England. Cholera was coming to Middlemarch from the south. The railways were coming to Middlemarch from the north, but neither had arrived yet. A novel set in the north of England about the railways would be very different. But it's also England. England is on the edge of some of these currents. England is not at the heart of some of these stories. The railways start in England, but the great transformation affected by the railways is really transcontinental railways. It's actually Europe, connecting up Europe or the United States. The thing about the railways in England is there's only so far they can go. It's an island. Yes, it's amazing you could get from Newcastle to London more quickly than you could have dreamt of, but it's nothing like getting from coast to coast of a whole continent. Reform in England is not revolution. Revolution is the European story. Between the setting and the publication of Middlemarch, the 1848 revolutions have happened. There was an echo of that in England, but the real story is in Europe. The loss of faith, the English version of it is mild. It's come from abroad. It's come primarily from Germany compared to what was going to happen in Germany. The story that George Eliot is describing, and in this case lies in the background of her novel, is the gentle English version. It is the gentle washing of these currents. It's not the raging storm. It's not Nietzsche. It's not the death of God. And for that reason, for some people, Middlemarch is too English a book for these grand themes. How can these grand themes be fully understood on the edges? England is on the edge. Middlemarch is not at the heart of the story. This is the provincial version. And some readers have rebelled against it. They want something more. One of the readers who rebelled against it was Nietzsche himself, who was scathing about George Eliot. And the thought is, the book he's thinking of is Middlemarch. It's not clear whether he ever actually read it. There were German translations of Middlemarch. And in Nietzsche's notebooks, he has passages from Middlemarch written down and scrawled over and loathed. But it's not clear he ever did more than read the reviews. It doesn't really matter because he knew what he hated. He was a hater. He was a great hater. And he hated this. Although he doesn't even have the energy to hate it. He patronizes it. This is what Nietzsche said about George Eliot. There's a little note he made. The note goes, G. Eliot. And then it says, "They are rid of the Christian God and now believe all the more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality. That is an English consistency. We do not wish to hold it against the little moralistic females a la Eliot. In England, one must rehabilitate oneself after every little emancipation from theology by showing in a veritably awe-inspiring manner what a moral fanatic one is. That is the penance they pay there. Little George Eliot, little female George Eliot, with her emancipation from God. So Nietzsche knows that George Eliot has imbibed the German understanding that Christianity is just a human construct. And in her fanaticism, she thinks her job is to reinvent, to reinstate the morality that's had the rug pulled out from under it. And Nietzsche is contemptuous. There's going to be no truth in this novel because it's an English novel. And for Nietzsche, an English novel just means everything that's taken away by philosophy, insight, science, genius, Nietzsche himself, is reinstated by the hypocritical English as just another superstructure of morality. And indeed, as he puts it here, a kind of hollow moral fanaticism. Nietzsche's wrong. When I reread Middlemarch just now, I found myself thinking, Nietzsche's really wrong, because the odd thing about Middlemarch is it's not a very English book, and George Eliot is not a very English writer. All of her influences were European, her primary influences, including German theology and post-theology. And reading the book, I found myself thinking, so far from being a kind of English book against Nietzsche, Englishness, English morality contra Nietzsche, actually, it's like a book written by an English Nietzsche. Its central themes are Nietzschean themes, the themes of the relationship between morality and power, and understanding morality, including Christian morality, as an extension of the human will to power. That actually is what Middlemarch is about, but it's hidden, and part of the reason it's hidden is that George Eliot is a genius, at least as great a genius as Friedrich Nietzsche. So I just want to give one example, and then I'm going to talk more about this in part 2 of this pair of podcasts about Middlemarch. The character that the book begins with, for some people the heroine of the book, though there are other characters who are just as important, is a young woman called Dorothea Brooke. She's very young. She's in her late teens when the book starts. She's in her early 20s when it ends. She is described as beautiful, high-minded, a principled person. She is well off. That is, she lives with her uncle, who's sort of her ward, and she has property that's coming to her. She leads a gentrified life, and there are certain expectations that go with that. She is a virtuous person, self-consciously virtuous person, and also clearly a religious person. She has faith, and she wants to do good in the world. Nietzsche would no doubt say she's a moralistic person. She wants to make a difference. And she has real moral ambition. She's driven by a real impulse to be more than she is told she is allowed to be. So she's also a very frustrated person because the expectations of a gentrified young woman like her, beautiful, with some property, is that she'll make a good marriage. And she's encouraged to pursue her desire to do good works, but good works on an appropriate scale, a Middlemarch scale. This is not actually the town Middlemarch. She is one of the country folk who live outside, but interact a lot with the people of Middlemarch. The book Middlemarch is about Middlemarch and its environs, which includes Dorothea Brooke's land. And she's told by her uncle, by her friends, that she should make improvements on the estate, make the lives of the tenants and the farm labourers better, look after the children, have educational projects, put her money to good use. Of course she should be good. Everyone wants to encourage worthy young women to be worthy and virtuous and good, but it's on a particular scale, and it's on an appropriate scale, and it includes marriage. And it is expected that she will marry a nice, benign member of the local gentry, a man called Sir James Chetham, who seems to maybe be in love with her. He's not clear, but he certainly thinks she would be a good match for him. Everyone expects it to happen. It makes sense. And Sir James Chetham says he's very keen to allow women, as he calls it, their ascendancy. He doesn't want to put women down. He doesn't want to say that someone like Dorothea Brooke should remain in the home and be kept away because she's a woman. She should be allowed to have projects. But he says That's because if she goes too far, I can always put her in her place. The thing about a man allowing his wife her head is that he can slap her down if it goes too far. That's the security of it. But Dorothea Brooke rebels, and she turns down Sir James Chetham and she marries someone else instead. She marries the single most depressing character in English literature, a 45-year-old man called the Reverend Edward Casaubon, who is awful. He is, and described by George Eliot as awful. He's not especially wicked. He's quite cruel. I mean, he's certainly cruel. But what he is above anything else is just depressing. He's a drag on life. He is a scholar in his own mind, a great scholar, and he's working on this epic project called The Key to All Mythologies. And he has been burrowing around in the archives, reading the dead languages of dead civilizations for decades, piecing together. It's never fully articulated what he thinks he's going to achieve, but I think the assumption is this man is an Anglican clergyman, that he is going to find in his scholarship and his study of ancient texts something that makes sense both in historical terms and also in theological terms, that it is going to be a shoring up of Christian religion, maybe mild Anglican Christian religion, but at the same time, it's going to be a work of great scholarship. At no point does he seem to have any German-style, let alone Nietzschean-style doubts that maybe if you root around in the historical origins and the myths behind religion, you pull the rug out from under it. Casaubon is not a puller out of the rug from under anything. He is dry and dusty and pompous and pedantic and humorless. And Dorothea persuades herself that she loves him. And never mind George Eliot, who makes it clear this is not a good idea. All those around her think it's a form of madness. They can't understand it. Why would a young woman like that want to tie herself? And this is an age in which marriage is a lifelong tie. There is really no divorce. Only death will release you from a bad marriage. Why would a young woman like that want to tie herself to a man like that? She gives her reasons. She says because she believes in the glory of his intellectual project, and she wants to serve him. She actually sees her marriage as a form of service, not of penance, but of service, because she thinks that he has a great vision. And she sometimes describes it. If she could be joined to him, physically joined to him, she could enter into the vistas of his mind, the open spaces that he is opening up with his great researches. And she can fulfill her desire to do good in the world by serving this man whose vision goes so far beyond Middlemarch and improvements to local cottages. This is a man who roams across the centuries, who roams in his mind across the myths of the ancient world. And as he pieces it all together, she will have an outlet for her desire for something much bigger and much grander than is her lot. And so what she sees as the purpose of this marriage is it is the vehicle for her desire to be something, to have a means of expressing her impulse to be greater than her situation allows as a young woman in provincial early 19th century England. He is her conduit to a vision of a far wider world. And she's wrong, because he's not like that at all. This vision turns out to be an illusion. And there are lots of haunting passages in the book, really despair-inducing passages, where the revelation dawns on her, and it comes pretty quickly. In fact, it comes on their honeymoon. It's the honeymoon in Rome, of which George Eliot says, we think we have more wisdom and knowledge of good and evil than these people, because we have a guidebook in our pockets. We don't. It's a learning experience for Dorothea on her honeymoon because she discovers that her husband is a kind of shrunken man. The implication, very opaquely spelt out, is that this is also probably a sexless marriage, or there is genuine literal impotence here. The frustration grows. If this marriage was to emancipate Dorothea from the frustrations of her lot, nothing on her honeymoon does anything other than increase those frustrations. She says at one point that she thought in marrying this man that she was joining him on a voyage in a vast open sea, which is a very Nietzschean image. And actually what she discovers is that she and he are trapped in a little basin. It's miserable. And then there's a really haunting moment when on her honeymoon, she meets a young man called Will Ladislaw, who's a cousin of Casaubon and actually a beneficiary of his. There's a complicated relationship between them, which I'll talk about in the next part. But he's a young man like her, young, full of life, as people thought she was before she tied herself to someone who's effectively embodies death. And Ladislaw meets Dorothea, is struck by her beauty, her energy, her vivacity, and can't understand why she's tied herself to this husk of a man. And he rails against it. He pushes his luck by trying to say to her, what the hell are you doing? And she gives her justifications to him. She says he's a great man. And for me, fulfillment, including emotional fulfillment, is going to come in his service, in the service of his great project. And Ladislaw, who's not much of a scholar, but he's a well-informed man of the world, young man of the world who knows his own mind, says to her, don't you even realize that this project isn't going to work because he can't read German? He actually hasn't read the Germans who are doing this for real. This is the English version. This is the Anglican version. This is the empty version. The real stuff is being done in Germany, and your husband is just fiddling around with relics to build a version of the past which isn't going to stand up to anyone's scrutiny. And the second that Dorothea hears that, and George Eliot is writing it and also hearing it, she knows it's true. Casaubon is way too English for this project. It is a dead end. The English version of this in 1829 is a dead end. It has to go, as it did for George Eliot, through Germany. The marriage is a complete disaster. It is one of the most catastrophic marriages in English literature, though Middlemarch contains another of the most catastrophic marriages in English literature. In the end, Dorothea is only emancipated by Casaubon's death. And on the road to his death, she has many miserable nights with him. Part of the implicit sexlessness of this marriage is we're told about their nighttime routine. Casaubon is quite a sickly man, even though he's only in his late 40s. His heart starts to fail, and there's a sense that he's not long for this world. He gets Dorothea to join him in bed at night when he can't sleep and to read him some of these books that he's researching on, or to read him back his notes from the day. It is utterly miserable and joyless. And bit by bit, Dorothea comes to realize that she's made a mistake. But because she is the kind of woman she is, she also doesn't believe that there is anything else she can do but live with her mistake. She is a very high-minded person. She's a kind of holy fool. She also has some saintly qualities in the sense that she's quite self-abnegating, almost self-lacerating. She doesn't in any way want his death. She does nothing to accelerate his death. She does everything she can to keep him alive, but he dies. His heart fails, and it fails after they never have terrible rows. They never have screaming rows. They have very repressed conversations in which the silences almost kill them both. And after one of these, he dies. And after his death, she discovers that she didn't know the worst of him, because the worst of him is only revealed after his death, and it's revealed in his will. And in his will, it turns out that he is suspicious of her relationship with Will Ladislaw, this young man, and he fears that Dorothea wants him dead so she can marry him. So in his will, he says, if she, my widow, marries that young man, she doesn't get a penny. And that's the cruelty. The dead hand of Casaubon reaches back from beyond the grave. Is this Nietzschean? I think it is. One of the things that Nietzsche said was, of the people who have no power. And at the start of this book, the distinguishing characteristic of not the person, Dorothea Brooke, but the plight in which she finds herself is that she is powerless as a young woman in that social setting. Nietzsche said of those who have no power, they would rather will nothing than not have a will. They would rather will nothingness than have to accept that they are powerless, because the willing of nothingness is at least an act of the will. It is at least a projection of the human being's desire to do something in the world, even if all that can be done is to choose to embrace the negation of life. For Nietzsche, that's what Christianity was. Christianity was the will to power of the powerless. It was the powerless willing the negation of life, which is what he thought of Christianity as, its dead moral hand, stifling human creativity, stifling the human desire to dominate, with its philosophy of the meek shall inherit the earth. That for Nietzsche is the dead hand of Christianity, but it's embraced by the powerless because it is the only vehicle for those who lack power to express their power, to try and stifle the power of everyone. Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch would rather will nothing than not have a will. It's on the micro-English provincial scale. It has none of the grandeur of Nietzsche's philosophy of Christianity, but not having a will would be marrying Sir James Chetham. Willing nothing, because Casaubon is nothing, he embodies nothing, is at least an exercise of the will. And it's what she does. And it's a mistake. In the same way that for Nietzsche, ultimately, humanity embracing Christianity is a terrible mistake, because if you will nothing, you are trapped by your choice. If that is the only outlet for your will, you are trapped by your choice. I don't want to make this too punning or too contrived, but Casaubon in his will says that a man called Will not marry his widow. And his widow had married him because that was the only possible expression of her will, her desire to be something in the world. It's channeled through Christianity, so she chooses the Christian version of it. She marries the Reverend Edward Casaubon, who embodies dead Christianity. But she does it because it is her choice. And she does it against the advice of all of her friends. And she does it because she is a willful young woman. She's like a character from a novel written by Nietzsche, if Nietzsche was English and Nietzsche was a woman. But part of George Eliot's genius is that this isn't just the story as seen from Dorothea's point of view. In one famous aside in the book, as she's telling us about the horrors of Dorothea's marriage from Dorothea's point of view, she stops and she reminds herself and her readers, and almost by implication her characters, that Casaubon isn't just death. He isn't just nothing. He is a human being too. He has his own will, which is expressed through his will by stopping Will from marrying his wife. But he also has feelings. He is, barely, but he is a flesh and blood human being. He has vanities. My God, he has vanities. He's driven by his desire to outdo his rival at All Souls, who once wrote a bad review of one of his articles. Like many academic types, actually, he's raging with the will to power. He just can't find an outlet for it. But even the ultimate act of negation that he performs, even the dead Casaubon reaching back his dead hand from beyond the grave to stifle the life of these two young people, who it seems likely maybe would want to marry each other were it not for this, even that act, the double negation, the nothingness that is Casaubon, who is now dead, exercising his nothingness from beyond the grave, is still an act of the will. It's still a choice. And that is also a Nietzschean theme, the idea that even the negation of life requires life to become an act in the world. There is no such thing as saying no to life. It can't be done. Even Casaubon can't do it, because saying no to life is an act that can only come from people who have some underlying belief in life. When he made that will, he was expressing himself as a living being and what he wanted to happen in the world. He was trying to express, for want of a better phrase, his will to power. Even Casaubon is actually a living, breathing, human creature who uses his faith, his moralistic view of the world, his pomposity, his vanity, to try and be something. Even the nothing is something. George Eliot understood that. Nietzsche also understood that. But Nietzsche could never have made it come alive in a novel in the way that George Eliot does. Dorothea and Casaubon are only two of the characters in this book. There are many, many others, many other plots, many other stories, and one other truly terrible marriage. And I want to talk about all of that in part 2 of this podcast. It turns out I didn't think I could contain everything I want to say about this book in one podcast. So just in this case, Middlemarch comes in 2 parts. To find out more about this series or this podcast, just visit our new website, ppfideas.com. Part 2 of Middlemarch is also out now.